Hi, my name is Dave Eagle. I've worked in mental health for the last 25 years. I was director of a mental health rehabilitation center where we worked with dual diagnosis, mostly psychotic individuals that also use substances as self-medication. And I've worked with schizophrenic populations for most of my mental health career. And I'm also here today to talk about pain. I think for myself, whenever I'm in a process of change, growth, or something that's requiring me to shift my perspective, and pain is definitely one of those things, I was searching for other alternatives, something that might yield a better way for me to manage the level of pain that I was in. I had a very hard time believing that this was going to be the way my life was, and that I just simply had to accept that for the rest of the time on this planet I was going to be in this level of severe pain. So that really opened me up to looking at other modes of pain management, and Dr. Bearman was the one that was recommended as the best with regard to compassion, level of academic and professional understanding about the benefits and drawbacks of using medical marijuana in the manner that was different than I'd been using it. I'd just been using it in conjunction with a lot of other things, but to use it solely as a primary pain management medication was new to me. And so I was interested in learning from a professional that had been doing this and been advocating for it and knew both sides of the equation, the good and the bad. Back in the day, this is again about 10-15 years ago, when I went to Dr. Bearman, Santa Barbara was in a lot of different iterations of how they viewed medical marijuana. For instance, my oldest son at the time had a lot of problems at birth, and he was struggling desperately with anxiety and panic attacks, and nothing had helped him, not any of the drugs, none of it. And so I sought out medical marijuana as an option for him, and not through Dr. Bearman, because he wasn't able at that time to even deal with minor children. I don't even know if he is now. But there was a group down in Ventura, and I don't remember the name, but they were advocating for children, kids, you know, that are on cancer medications, that are in terrible pain, that maybe have seizure issues. They were advocates for these kids, and I sought them out to see if it would bring some relief to my son, who was 15 at that point, and was able to get him a medical marijuana card. I think they said he was the youngest in California at the time. And we got that through Department of Health and Human Services here. And that's where I found out about the card. I got myself one. And it was right about the time that I met up with Dr. Bearman. So in essence, he writes the prescription, and then the Santa Barbara tells you what you have to do to comply. And at that time, it was get a card, like a driver's license. Go get your picture taken, all of that. And I believe my son and I both had those cards. Yeah, before, when you had to go to a card, you had to go make an appointment down at Health and Human Services. They interviewed me. They made me, I believe, fill out a questionnaire. Essentially, a formal apologetic for why I should even be allowed to do this, even though my doctor had already prescribed it. And I think it was really just their way at the time. They were this was new to them, they didn't understand it, and they wanted to kind of have a control over it. So if they had pictures and a card and something that was an ID, like a license, and they were working with law enforcement, so it was, I think, a combination effort of sheriffs and Health and Human Services to give us a way of just saying, no, we've already gone through the system. And so it was much more formal and prohibitive, because if you didn't have, they charged, I think, it was like almost $50, $60 to go through that process. So it was not cheap. So you had to be kind of committed to do it. Much more difficult than it is now. Santa Barbara itself has gone through a process of growth around this. I remember there were years when they had dispensaries in town, but these were just really under a lot of oppression and attack, and they'd be driven out in 6 months to a year by all of the activists and the groups. And so Santa Barbara County, I think they stopped issuing the medical marijuana cards about 10 years ago, I want to say. It wasn't practical. There was too much administrative stuff, and people were getting medical marijuana prescriptions and could go outside of Santa Barbara County and go to dispensaries that weren't having problems in other cities. And there's always been an LA component that are willing to deliver to Santa Barbara. And so they saw that Santa Barbara was anti-medical marijuana, and all the surrounding cities have filled in those gaps until now. Santa Barbara is apparently getting on the bandwagon. But they've been a difficult city to get support for over a decade. So with regard to the prescription of marijuana, my feeling is it's like every other medicine that would be prescribed. It's unique to the client. And although Dr. Bearman is knowledgeable and very well versed in all of the different kinds of medications, happy to talk to you, he is really not pushing one method or another. He really encourages a person to explore, very kind of informally with what's available, and to not rush into something, and to really sit with what product that's available works and is effective. The key here is that as Santa Barbara has evolved its understanding of medical marijuana, the industry has evolved, and the products are much more variety of them, and the quality is different. For me, though, it never really changed. I've been using marijuana, medical and otherwise, most of my adult life, and I don't like, concentrates, anything like that. I just like the flower. And so I just get good flower and smoke it, and that does it for me. I don't use edibles. I don't use any of that. I like to be in control of the medication that I'm taking, and for me that's the most practical way to control it. I know what I'm taking. I know how it will affect me. And the other thing that I want to make clear is medical marijuana for me is not by any stretch of the imagination a pain reliever. When I went off the opiates that are classified as, analgesics to remove pain, while marijuana might have analgesic properties for some people, it does not for me. So I've been bearing the full weight of my pain ever since I went off. What marijuana allows me to do is it allows me to moderate my pain in a way that I otherwise wouldn't be able to. And what I mean by that is pain for me, how I experience it, it's very immediate. It's very overwhelming, and marijuana helps me to create a kind of a psychological buffer where I can get a handle on it and manage it from within, as opposed to just being victimized by my own body. And that's what I like about it. And that's the clarity I never had with the opiates, because by nature, they're there to kind of subdue everything. And for me, the answer to really living with pain long term is cooperative, collaborative. It's really coming to an agreement with your body and how you and your body move forward. And marijuana is nice in the sense that it allows collaborativeness. It does not impose. And that to me is the if there's anything magical about marijuana, is that for some people, and I'm one of them, it gives me a handle on myself that otherwise would be not impossible. I think if I didn't have marijuana right now for the rest of my life, I've been able to achieve peace and I could maintain that, but it makes it a heck of a lot easier. And it just helps settle everything. I don't use a lot though, and that's the other thing I want to say is I will maybe puff 3-4 times a day. Just take a puff of flower and that's pretty much it. It's not a lot is needed. And so going from massive amounts of opium to just very little bit of flower that, you know, I really can't tell one way or the other if I've smoked or not smoked, other than my stomach's a little more settled and I don't have that discomfort of holding the pain. But other than that, you'd never know. So that's kind of the process. So with regard to the medical marijuana that I do use, it depends really on how I'm feeling at the time. Indica is, of course, much better suited to body pain, and for me, it is a little more calming of a product with regard to medicinal use. The sativas, though, I think sometimes get a bad rap as just being, you know, a high THC content. People just take them to get high, and that's not for me the what I experience either. The sativas, for me, are better when I have to accomplish a lot of things and I don't want to be so sedated. I want to be much more alert. And as I said, I do just smoke the flower. I do not ingest it. I don't use concentrates. I really like the ability to, one, be using something that is just grown, like farm to table type mentality. I don't like it when it's processed. But I also like that it's very, very easy for me to know what I'm taking as a medication, because it's very, the actual pharmacological part of the medical marijuana is distributed equally throughout the flower. So a pinch is a pinch always, depending on the strain. There are really good strains. I have a preference to something that's called Tangy, and it's a tangerine-like flower that smells very much like tangerine. And but mostly the higher-end strains that provide, you know, a good amount of THC. 15% in a flower is pretty high these days, you know, 20% in there. And that's sufficient for me, really is. Don't need much more than that. I'm not looking to get high or buzzed. I'm looking to get the effect that allows me to create that context where I can manage my pain. And it's something that I at least had to work at, because if I had just taken the medical marijuana and thought it was like a pill, like opium, that would just work on my pain receptor sites, I don't believe that it probably does. But it lets me work on my pain receptor sites through wiring my brain a little differently, and maybe creating my own dopamine and my own kind of filling my own receptors with me instead of looking to something else. So I would classify medical marijuana more as a facilitating medicine than anything else for me with regard to pain, for sure. Because it's not a linear path to you take medical marijuana and then you don't feel pain. It's a very non-linear path. It really requires that you are in collaboration with the medicine. It requires something from the patient to mediate. And that's, I think, the component that people miss in trying to understand, because they think of a medicine as something that you're passive about. You're just given it and then it does its thing. With medical marijuana, it's very much a relationship that you have to form with the medication and get comfortable with all that. And that I never hear talked about. My son, Max Ironwood Eagle, he was about 15, I believe, when I sought out a medical marijuana license for him. But just a quick back history, he was premature. He was, I think, under 6 pounds, spent 3-4 months in neonatal intensive care, almost didn't make it. And he had some brain damage as a result of that. And so he struggled quite a bit through school and through developmentally, and it left him with a lot of overwhelming anxiety. And so I was desperate as his dad to find something that would help him to better manage his life. And that is the process that brought me to having him get his card. Now, it did work, and he was doing well, but because of the other mental health issues he had, he wasn't responsible in his use of the card and the medical marijuana. And so out of a respect for these doctors that had really gone out on a limb, as him being, I think, either the youngest or the youngest in that county, I told them to revoke the card because, well, this is, you know, this was way early on, and I didn't want his inability to adhere to the guidelines to jeopardize another child that might have been able to benefit. And so I actually went back a year later and had them revoke the card for him. He still continued to use it, but these guidelines, I think, are there for a reason. And if we ever hope to educate the general public, I think it's important that anybody that has a medical marijuana card, they don't abuse that privilege, and that they differentiate, even though it's legal right now, that you use the medicine in a way that's according to whatever laws may exist, and maybe hold yourself a little bit above, because just because it's legal for everyone else now doesn't mean it's still not the medicine that you're taking to manage your own medical issues. When I was forced to revoke my son's medical marijuana card, it was an acknowledgement on my part that, you know, he was, in a sense, not old enough to understand the responsibility of having that medical card, but it was also an acknowledgement that he was maybe not going to have an easy path of it. And as it turned out, he didn't. And he did end up self-medicating throughout his life, and eventually got into a lot worse drugs. Now, I don't even want to suggest that medical marijuana was somehow a doorway into his self-medication and his inevitable kind of outcome. But what I will say is that people that, because I do work with dual diagnosis, people that are profoundly mentally ill and then seek out a way to just not suffer so much. And we call that self-medicating. But it truly, people are just looking for a way not to sit in deep, profound pain, whether it's emotional, psychological, or whether it's physical. And I can relate to that. In my son's case, his was both. He had bad burns over a large part of his lower body, and that got him onto pain meds. And from that point, that was really for him something that worked. And when they stopped the pain medications, he did what a lot of people now are doing and moved to heroin. And the heroin potentially could have been overcome, but he was a musician, and the group of people he was around used meth, and the problem with meth is it rewires your brain, and so he lost the capacity to really modulate his self-medication, and he actually overdosed in 2017, died. It was February 23rd. And that is the thing that we're dealing with right now. Medical marijuana may be scary to a lot of people, and medical marijuana may be a big change for a lot of people. But we're in the middle of an opium crisis that is real and here. And I believe we need to find healthy alternatives to the way we look at managing pain, severe or terminal illness, mental health for sure. And medical marijuana is getting a bad rap because it's always been a good way for regular people to self-medicate that didn't get you a drunk driving charge, didn't get you a domestic violence charge, didn't ruin your whole life. I've just not seen it. I'm sure it exists, but somebody that smoked a joint and, beat their wife or husband or children, and it's just not, it I'm sure happens, but it's just not the case. But medical marijuana is getting thrown into these areas of self-medication that I don't think are appropriate. It's not the same thing. Everybody's searching for relief from suffering. But medical marijuana has a legitimate place to stand outside of that. It has other benefits than pain management. It has other benefits than traditional medicine would suggest. And that's why it really needs to be kind of de-demonized. It's not a gateway to anything except what you would already be heading towards. Originally, when I got Max his medical marijuana card, we explored strains. Now, again, back then, because of Santa Barbara specifically with their dispensaries, and because of California generally, the attitude, there wasn't a lot of selection variety. I was lucky enough to hook up with local growers that were in compliance at the time and get really high quality organic, locally grown flowers. And so for my son who had really bad anxiety and panic attacks and generalized anxiety, he found that a hybrid really worked well for him. It was part indica and part sativa. And so it had enough of both to be both a little bit uplifting but not too heady, and then also the body kind of somatic calming of the indica. And it was just a perfect blend because, an adolescent to begin with is all over the map. And so this didn't get him too in his head, and it calmed him enough so he'd be present in his body. And that really worked well for him for about 6 months. If I wanted somebody to take anything away from what I'm saying, it would be that if you live with any kind of pain, whether it's psychological, physical, a combination of the two, because typically they don't exist apart from one another, pain is a real difficult phenomenon to overcome. And typically we don't have a lot of resources in medical industry, healing industry, whatever, around profound pain. We don't deal well with profound loss. We don't deal well with profound pain. It's something that not just caregivers, but people in general want to avoid. And so if you take anything away from what I'm saying, it would be that it is entirely possible to overcome profound pain if you're willing to sit with it and sit with the medications that help to manage it. And if you're going to go the route of not using opiates or other analgesics that plug into your receptor sites, then you have to be extremely comfortable with the process, whether it's medical marijuana or whatever you so choose to use, that your brain is adaptive for sure, but it takes time to rewire so that the pain you now have to live with becomes normative. And it could take a year. In my case, it took several years of lots of sleepless nights, lots of agony, lots of all of it to really recalibrate my psyche so that all the messages I get from my foot, which still doesn't have cartilage and is the exact same it was when the doctor put it together, and I haven't magically grown cartilage, so there's nothing that's changed except the way that I respond to it. And medical marijuana helped. It was almost like a mediator. It functioned in the capacity of saying, well, what about this, or what about that, or, you know, like, I see you're really today fighting your pain, and why are you doing that? And you really, I think, in some way, shape, or form, however a person does it, you have to come to peace with what you're living with. If you can't be at peace with what you're living with, then peace is going to evade you probably for the rest of your life. And that would be what I would suggest medical marijuana is really good at doing for some people. I think that people in general should understand the sacred plant as being a facilitator of other human beings finding a way to alleviate suffering. That if there's sacredness in the plant, it is the sacredness that human beings hold around eliminating suffering. I think people would need to know about the sacred plant in the sense that this plant that has so much mysticism and mystique around it is really just a naturally grown plant that human beings have realized have some qualities that potentially are medicinal. And so the sacredness for me is human beings in general being on the same page, having consensus around that this particular plant has qualities that in some cases can help human beings grapple with deep suffering, deep loss, and pain. And so anything that is capable of that is and should be sacred.